Okay, so thank you for joining us today, Gina. And before we start, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your work at Reuters?
Sure. So I'm Gina Chua. I'm executive editor at Reuters. It's a little bit of an amorphous title. What it really means is that I run a fair chunk of what you would call, what we call editorial operations. I guess you would call bureaucracy. So it means, I make sure that things run smoothly, budgets, admin, all that boring stuff, but also, the things that keep people safe, security, mental health. That's everything from, flak jackets to digital security to COVID-19 security, all of that kind of stuff. And I deal with projects as they come up. I work with the technology people to make sure we've got the right tools for the newsroom. I do a fair amount of liaison with the business side of things, so we can look at sort of commercial projects and where they go. And I've got sort of really specific interests as well in helping us move forward on new forms of storytelling. I have a real interest in graphics and data particularly. And then I also have a real interest in thinking about diversity beyond representation in the newsroom and extending that further into, what is our news judgment, who are our stories, what are our stories, whose stories do we tell, whose voices do we hear, that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Okay, so how has the news landscape changed over the course of your career, which has lasted over 30 years, in terms of diverse spaces and faces that appear?
All right, well, how hasn't it changed, right, in that time? Look, I started as a reporter in, 1985, maybe. And to be fair, I mean, I started in Singapore, and so everybody, in the newsroom was Singaporean. Most people were Asian. In fact, the vast majority of people were Asian of multiple different stripes. If you know anything about Singapore, it's a pretty multicultural place. But then, over the years, as I moved into working, first for Reuters and then for the Wall Street Journal, and now back at Reuters again, clearly I moved into environments which were much more Western focused. And so there's always a little bit of adjustment to those things. The way I sort of tell the story, at least for me, is I grew up as a colonial subject. I was born in 1961 in Singapore, which was still a British colony. And so when you grow up in that situation, basically every Western person you see is in charge of something. They're a boss, the boss's wife, because often it was a man who was in charge. And so it becomes very, it affects the mind when you suddenly, as I was when I became editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal, to suddenly be in charge of a newsroom full of Westerners. And you're sort of trying to sort of sort that in your brain, because it's just a very odd place to be. So at least in my experience, there's been a lot more diversity in newsrooms, certainly in the newsrooms that I've worked at. There's obviously a long ways that still needs to be, there's still a lot more that needs to be done, but it has changed fairly dramatically in my 30-some years in the business.
And what are some of the ways, some of the work that needs to be done in terms of diversity?
Oh God, I think there's two types of work that needs to be done. I think one is really about the question of, can newsrooms be more representative of the world that they cover, of the communities that they serve, and that's really a question of hiring, promotions, that sort of thing. So that's representation. And then I think the other side of it is how can the stories we do, the coverage, that we have, how can that be more representative of the world and of the communities that we're serving? And I think that both things require a lot of work, but they require different kinds of work, right? In terms of representation and hiring, a lot of that really builds on good hiring practices. It builds on interesting way to put it is to work on the basis of blind hiring processes, if you like. I think what happens is that in many cases it isn't really a question of we want to hire more diverse people. We want to hire the best people, and often we get in the way of that. So I think that there are many methods for doing that, including more anonymized tests for people for hiring for skills. It involves making sure we really understand what a job requires, so that we actually hiring for those skills and not hiring for a kind of person in our mind, because often the kind of person in our mind is very much the person that used to have the job. And if you keep doing that, you're not going to get any change. The best example of this is American orchestras, which used to be mostly men and hired very few women. And the way they hired musicians was to have a music test. They'd come in and they'd play, and the best musicians or the senior musicians in the orchestra would listen, and they would hire the best person or the best musician, or at least so they thought. And they hired a lot of men. Then they just started doing blind auditions where people would play behind a curtain. And then miraculously, they hired a lot of women. And so the lesson here is that they weren't trying to hire women. They were trying to hire the best musicians. But apparently, when you can see them, it affects your hearing. So the best way I can think of to sort of improve representation and diversity in the newsroom is to try and create as many of those blind tests, if you like, right? If you're hiring a copy editor, have a copy editing test and anonymize the results, and then score them. And after you've done that, then see who you got, and you should be getting the best candidates. That's one side of it. The other side of it, though, I think still is, you can't depend on representation to make your news file, your output more representative. That requires a lot more sensitivity training. That requires people thinking about what news really is. For most of us, the definition of news is something that's unusual, right? Dog bites man's not unusual. Man bites dog is unusual. Plane takes off, not a story. Plane crashes. That's a story. The problem is in what is your definition of normal. And you have a definition of normal, I have a definition of normal that comes from our lived experience. And for a long time, newsrooms were controlled by a particular group of people who had a particular lived experience. And so their experience is when something is out of the ordinary to them, that's a story. But maybe that's not true to other people. You can't have everyone's lived experience run a newsroom, but you can be much more open to the multiple voices in your newsroom if you have a representative newsroom, and the multiple voices in your community that you're serving, to be able to get a better sense of what is a story and why it matters.
So, you mentioned blind testing and being more sensitive. What are some other tips that you can give to newsroom leaders who want to make their newsrooms more diverse?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it really does start with the hiring, right? And I think the more you can do to be, colorblind, gender blind, all of that when you hire, I think the higher the chances are that you will get a more diverse newsroom. And I think if you can commit to doing that, I think you go a long ways to having those people in your newsroom. But once they're in your newsroom, the question is like, what do you do with them? And there was a time I remember when certainly way back, women were sent off to the women's beat. Diverse people were sent off to the ethnic minority beat, and that sort of thing. And that honestly doesn't help anyone that much in the sense that, you want people to have robust careers going around the newsroom and that you should be able to cover anything. It is true, in theory at least, that women would understand, quote, women's issues better. But you have to ask yourself, how much of a beat is that, and what are the stereotypes that you built into it? In the same way that an immigrant could probably write about immigrant issues better than a non-immigrant. But again, you don't want to say only immigrants can cover immigrant issues, and you want to say immigrants can't cover other things, right? So part of it is being much more expansive in your view of what people's skills are, giving them opportunities to try beats. But I think most fundamentally, it's about welcoming different voices at the table when you are talking about a story, so that news judgment isn't just what one person at the head of the table says it is, and that you can have an open discussion about why a story might matter or why it might not matter. I'll give you another example, and I won't name the publication, but actually, but it's true of almost every publication or every major metro newspaper in the U.S., which is, what is a newsworthy killing? And generally speaking, again, it's something out of the ordinary. And if it's something out of the ordinary, it's like, young co-ed gets killed at whatever, blonde woman, murdered in whatever neighborhood. And that's not to say those stories aren't valuable. They are valuable. But then there's a ton of other killings that don't get covered. And why don't they get covered? Why aren't they important? And this was a question that two people, Laura Amico and husband Chris Amico, asked when they set up Homicide Watch DC many years ago. Sadly, it's not really functioning anymore, and they both moved on to do other things. But they just turned the entire notion of newsworthy on its head. They said, we're going to cover every murder in DC. It's about 100 murders in DC a year, and they covered every single one of them. And, I'm not saying this is right or this is wrong. What I'm saying is that there are many different ways to think about newsworthiness, and that we do ourselves a disservice, but more importantly, we do the communities that we serve a disservice when we don't think expansively about what matters to them.
Great. So have you seen anything that either encourages or discourages you personally when you look at diversity and inclusion in media?
Oh, there's a ton of things to be encouraged about. I think that, well, first of all, I mean, if you look back over 30 years, I think there's been a ton of progress, right? And I think you can argue about, is there enough? Should there be more? Should it be faster? Sure. But there's been a huge amount of progress. The new editor of the Washington Post, Sari Busby, is a woman. The new editor-in-chief of Reuters, my boss, Alessandra Goloni, is the first woman in 170 years. You can ask, should have cut there faster, but okay, but it's still, a new thing. The last two editors of the New York Times have been a Black man and a woman. So, a lot has changed. And I think that's generally good. I think that the desire for change has accelerated over the last few years. You can see it, I think, in the ways that news organizations are going out of their way to look for more diverse talent. You can certainly see it in enrollment at journalism schools, where the students that come in are just hugely more diverse, and they are, getting really well trained, and they're getting good jobs. So I'm pretty optimistic about all of that. I mean, I think you have to set that off against the backdrop of the fact that, it's a difficult environment for news. And so, it's certainly not at this point the heyday of news that it was, if there ever was one, 20 years ago. But still, I think that, they're startups, they're new ways of telling stories. And they're just a lot more interesting experiments out there. One of the really interesting developments, I think, is the creation of single issue newsrooms, especially single issue nonprofit newsrooms. So, not only do you have ProPublica, which is obviously a sort of expansive nonprofit uninvestigated journalism, but you've got, The Trace, which looks at guns. You've got the Marshall Project, which looks at criminal justice system. You've got the 19th, which looks at women's issues. And so I think that those are all really interesting experiments, I guess you would say, or startups or new ventures into, really serving very different constituencies and communities well. And I think that that's a great thing for journalism. It's a great thing for news. It's a great thing for society. So I'm really quite upbeat about many things.
That's great. Let's move, unfortunately, to something less upbeat. How has the pandemic affected the news industry? And are there any effects specifically on diversity?
Ooh, good question. So we'll start with the good news. I think the pandemic, at least for a while, and long may it continue, I think really elevated the importance of news and accurate information for a lot of people. I mean, I know there's a ton of disinformation out there, and I know that not everything is believed, but I think by and large, if you look at traffic statistics, if you look at the fact that, people really did need to know what might kill them and what might not, it put news front and center in people's minds again. It wasn't a spectator sport. It was truly life or death. And so, it's a harsh thing to say, because obviously the pandemic has taken this horrific toll on the world. But certainly it's told us why it matters to be informed. I think most news organizations managed well. I think most news organizations pivoted well to covering the pandemic. I think that what it did for many of us is remind us of our public service mission, and that's one of the that's clearly something that drives the passion in the industry. And so a lot of people, threw themselves into it. A lot of news organizations threw themselves into it and done some of the best coverage. Once in a lifetime coverage. So those are sort of, I think, the good points, if you like. It's obviously undercut any number of news organizations dramatically, because it's advertising revenue, even as it may have driven some subscriptions. Advertising has fallen in many cases. Economic activity in many cities obviously also took a nosedive, and that has a real impact again, because newspapers are dependent on the general economy. So those are problems, and if you take those issues and you sort of take the downstream effect of them, newspapers that are suffering are not able to hire. They're not able to hire. That has an impact on future diversity, at least. They can't change their workforce. They can't bring in new people. So you have what you have is what you have, right? Now, again, we're seeing some movement there. I think that the most resilient of the news organizations, the large international news organizations, large national news organizations, I think we've seen recovery there, including with us. And so, we're out hiring, and more people are hiring, and I think that's a good sign, at least in theory, for diversity. So we'll see how that goes. But I think more broadly, the industry has taken a hit, and that is a sad note to all the other sad notes that we've had this year.
And where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? Well, so some of this I think is going to be, at least in this country, right, and to some extent, I guess in other countries. But I think there is a sifting that's going on. The larger, more well-funded, more robust organizations are obviously doing well. So, or at least doing better than the others. And I think that they have more staying power. And again, we've seen it in this country. We've seen where the recovery has gone first. And to the extent that you like those news organizations, you work for them, you like their news, that's good, because they're coming out of this in, maybe not stronger than before, but they're coming out of it pretty resilient. The thing that we all have to wonder about and worry about is, what happens to the smaller newsrooms, the ones that were, have been much more disproportionately hit by the pandemic and by the economic crisis. what will happen to them, what will happen to their journalists, and what will happen to the communities that that they provided news to. And I think that that's a really worrying sign. How will if we already have, to some extent, at least in the US, a news desert problem, how much worse might it get? And again, I've seen green shoots. I've seen people start up things. I've seen new ideas and new experimentation come forth even in these dark times. But the jury's still out, and I think it's going to be, I guess the right word is interesting, time to look forward to.
Okay, and on that note, I think thank you for the absolutely brilliant answers, and I think our listeners will take away a lot from it.
Well, thank you for having me.